To understand what actually unfolded between the United States and Canada, you have to look beyond the speeches and stage press briefings and focus on the ground reality underneath everything. You probably noticed the headlines and urgent news alerts lighting up your phone, talking about tariffs, trade fights, and sharp language coming from the Trump administration aimed at the country to the north. The version of events being sold was familiar: strength, tough bargaining, the belief that the United States could simply apply pressure and force better terms from its partners. A story where one side raises its voice and the other eventually backs down. But when you look at the real economic indicators and the immediate response inside the commodities markets, a very different picture appears. This was not a show of strength. It was an exposure of deep weakness. We need to walk through this carefully because it reveals a basic truth about the global economy that is routinely ignored by political leaders who think threats can replace planning. The reality is simple. When the administration floated tariffs on Canadian potash, they were not putting pressure on Canada's economy. They were aiming straight at the American farmer and, by extension, every American consumer. To understand how serious this mistake was, you need to understand what potash actually represents. This is not a discretionary product. It is not a luxury item like electronics or software that people can skip when prices rise. Potash is potassium. It is a core input for plant growth. It sits at the heart of modern agriculture. Remove it and crop yields fall. Food output weakens. This is not a preference. It is biology. Now look at the structural reality of supply. Nearly 90% of the potash used by American farmers comes from Canada. Pause on that figure. 90%. This is not a flexible market where suppliers can be swapped overnight. It is near total reliance. So when tariffs were threatened, what was really being proposed was a tax on the foundation of American farming itself. The markets recognized this instantly, even if the political advisors did not. The moment the threat was spoken aloud, prices jumped. There was no waiting for legislation or negotiation. The reaction was immediate. This is the part most mainstream coverage missed entirely. While commentators argued about political strategy, markets were already pricing in damage. Fear moves faster than policy. Even the hint of disruption was enough to send costs soaring. And who absorbed those costs? Not Canadian mining firms. The impact landed on farmers in Iowa, growers in California, and producers across the Midwest, who suddenly faced input costs that no longer added up. This was a textbook own goal. So the obvious question follows: why would a political leadership choose to attack a supply chain so central to its own economic stability? The answer lies in a misunderstanding of how power actually works today. There is an assumption that political messaging can overpower physical and geological constraints, but geology does not respond to slogans or press releases. Canada holds the world's largest high-quality potash reserves. That is a fixed reality. No amount of rhetoric can alter it. What we witnessed here was a collision between the illusion of political dominance and the hard limits of economic structure. On the surface, the message was toughness on trade. Underneath, the United States was exposing a critical vulnerability. This is what happens when trade policy becomes performance instead of analysis. Treating economic relationships as zero-sum contests, where one side must lose for the other to win, is dangerous in a deeply integrated global system, especially within North America. You cannot destroy the bridge you are standing on and expect only the other side to fall. The immediate hit to the U.S. economy was self-inflicted. It functioned as a tax on American production imposed by American leadership while claiming to defend American interests. The irony is hard to miss. We often talk about the invisible hand of the market, but here the hand was visible and clumsy. Canada did not respond with noise. There were no dramatic counter-threats or public escalation. They did not need to react at all. They understood something the U.S. administration clearly did not. In this sector, the United States depends far more on Canada than the reverse. That is what real structural leverage looks like. It does not shout. It does not panic. It waits. While the U.S. side created uncertainty and raised costs for its own population, Canada quietly reinforced its trade ties and prepared targeted responses. They understood that control over essential resources carries more weight than political theater. This moment is a small example of a broader failure. Economic diplomacy has increasingly been replaced with intimidation. But intimidation only works when you actually hold leverage. In the case of critical raw materials, leverage sits with the producer. By threatening Canada, the administration did not project strength. It revealed a lack of basic economic understanding. Markets noticed. This kind of instability is toxic. Farmers cannot plan when costs can spike overnight due to political impulse. Businesses cannot commit capital when trade rules change without warning. The predictability required for long-term growth was traded away for a short news cycle. We will dig deeper into who benefits from this chaos because it is not ordinary people. It is not families facing higher food prices as farm inputs rise. It is not rural regions that rely on a steady agricultural base. Some interests thrive on disorder, and they need to be named. But first, one thing must be clear. The claim that this protected American industry was false. You cannot defend domestic production by cutting off its raw materials. You cannot increase national wealth by making food more expensive to produce. The core failure here is the gap between the myth of self-sufficiency and the reality of interdependence. We are told we can stand alone, but the Potash episode proved within hours that we cannot. Prices cross borders even when goods are blocked. When you tax a critical import, you are not hurting the foreign supplier. You are hurting yourself. That leads to the final question. Why pursue this approach at all? Was it ignorance or intentional distraction? In many cases, the noise is the strategy, and that is where the story goes next. The clash itself was manufactured to create the appearance of decisive action. But in economics, action always triggers reaction. And the reaction here was an instant shift of wealth away from American farmers and toward speculative markets, and ultimately toward the very foreign producers this policy claimed to target. It is a deeply inverted outcome. You are being encouraged to applaud a policy that leaves you worse off. You are being asked to support an approach that weakens the foundation of the national economy. This keeps happening because the real mechanics of trade disputes are almost never explained in plain language. You hear about billions in tariffs and assume that money is being taken from another country. That is not how tariffs work. The importer pays them. That means an American company pays them, and that cost is eventually passed on to you. The Potash episode makes this especially clear. There is no replacement for fertilizer. You cannot innovate your way out of depleted soil in the middle of a growing season. Demand does not bend. Economists call this inelastic demand. No matter how high prices rise, farmers still have to buy it or shut down. By floating this tariff threat, the administration effectively handed speculators a green light and said, squeeze. And they did. Prices jumped not because supply vanished, but because the risk of disruption entered the system. That is the cost of uncertainty. That is the price of mismanagement. And it fits into a larger pattern of using trade policy like a hammer inside a system that requires precision. The damage occurred before a single tariff dollar was collected. The threat alone was enough to destabilize the market and punish the domestic economy. This shows us something important about the modern economy. Credibility and stability are forms of currency just as real as money itself. When a government loses its reputation for predictable behavior, it injects a risk premium into everything connected to it. And you are the one who ends up paying that premium. To understand how this happened, you have to examine the official explanation offered to the public. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. The administration framed the issue as national pride and fairness. The claim was that Canada had an unfair advantage and that tariff threats were simply a way to level the field. Tariffs were presented as bargaining chips. The assumption was that pressure in one area would force concessions elsewhere, maybe in dairy, lumber, or auto parts. This logic treats global trade like a real estate negotiation where volume and intimidation decide the outcome. The message was clear. This was strength. This was protection. This was America standing up to a competitor. But that framing collapses the moment you look at the actual fertilizer market. It assumes all commodities are interchangeable and all suppliers can be replaced. That assumption is not just wrong, it is dangerous. Potash is not produced in a competitive free-for-all. It comes from a highly concentrated market where a small number of players control most of the supply. Canada is the central node. Saskatchewan holds the largest and highest quality reserves on the planet. In practical terms, Canada plays the role that Saudi Arabia plays in oil. The United States does not have the geological capacity to replace that supply. This is not a question of policy ambition or investment appetite. It is a physical constraint. You cannot legislate mineral deposits into existence. So when tariffs were threatened, the United States was not pressuring a supplier it could swap out. It was threatening a dominant producer it had no alternative to. The most misleading part of the official narrative was the suggestion that the United States held leverage. In this relationship, the leverage runs in the opposite direction. By pretending otherwise, the administration walked the country into an economic trap of its own creation. This is where you have to step back and look at the larger system because it reveals how detached political decision-making has become from material reality. The global food system rests on a fragile chain of inputs. We focus on grocery prices, but rarely on the industrial processes that make food possible. Potash is mined deep underground in massive capital-intensive operations. Bringing a new mine online takes years and billions of dollars. Production cannot be ramped up on demand because a politician is upset. Supply is rigid in the short term, and that rigidity matters. It means shocks do not smooth out gradually. They produce sharp price spikes. The system is optimized for efficiency, not for resilience against political volatility. By injecting uncertainty into this rigid structure, the administration triggered a panic the market could not absorb. The broader context makes this even clearer. North America spent decades integrating its economies to reduce costs and improve reliability. This was intentional. American farmers benefit from having a stable, nearby supply of high-quality fertilizer connected by reliable rail infrastructure. That proximity is a structural advantage. It keeps costs lower than importing from distant suppliers like Russia or Belarus. When you threaten to disrupt that integration, you are not defending national strength. You are dismantling one of your own competitive advantages. You are taking a system that functions smoothly and deliberately introducing damage into it. The modern economy rewards consistency. It rewards environments where businesses can plan, price risk, and invest with confidence. When a government becomes a source of instability, every actor downstream responds defensively. Companies sit on cash. They hedge aggressively. They delay investment. Money moves more slowly through the system, and that slowdown becomes a tax on the entire economy. This is where inelastic demand becomes central to the story, because it is the force that crushed American farmers in this situation. Inelastic demand means you cannot walk away. If airfare gets expensive, you cancel the trip. If fertilizer prices spike, you still have to fertilize your fields unless you want to shut down your operation. The sellers understand this. The traders understand this. The moment the tariff threat appeared, the market recognized that farmers were captive buyers. Whatever price emerged, they would have to pay it. The leverage the administration believed it held over Canada never actually existed. The real leverage lived in geology and market structure. Canada understood that from the start. There was no need for outrage or retaliation. They responded with the calm confidence of someone who controls the only exit. They knew the United States would eventually retreat or severely damage its own agricultural base. That brings us to the real question. Who pays for political theater like this? In global trade, costs almost never land on those who create the problem. They move downward until they reach the participant least able to push back. In this case, the costs moved quickly, from speculators to distributors, and finally to farmers. Canadian mining companies had no reason to cut prices. They control a product the world depends on. Instead, the uncertainty premium was simply added to the price faced by American buyers. This is how protectionist talk often produces the opposite result. Rather than shielding the domestic economy, it exposed it to a sudden price shock that drained cash from rural America. Wealth flowed out of productive farming communities and into financial markets built to profit from volatility. There is also a geopolitical layer that cannot be ignored. For decades, the United States helped construct a global system based on rules and trade agreements. These frameworks exist to manage disputes without turning commerce into warfare. When the leading power abandons those rules and relies on coercion, it weakens the entire structure. It tells other countries that agreements are temporary and force is the only language that matters. But power is not absolute. As the Potash case demonstrated, military strength and economic size mean little if you lack control over essential inputs. Canada exercised a quieter, more durable form of power, resource dominance. They did not need speeches or threats. The market itself enforced their position. This exposes an uncomfortable truth about capitalism. Despite the language of free markets, the system is shaped by power relationships. A monopoly supplier and a dependent buyer do not negotiate as equals. That dependency is structural. The administration chose to ignore it and acted as if political will could override physical reality. It cannot. Reality always asserts itself. The Potash episode became a lesson in the limits of bluster. You cannot intimidate a supply chain you do not control. You cannot treat trade as a battlefield without damaging the network of dependencies that keeps your economy running. And while attention has moved on, the vulnerability remains. The dependency remains. Until leaders understand the mechanics of the resources their economies rely on, the public will continue paying for that ignorance. This story is not really about fertilizer. It is about hubris and economic gravity, about the gap between political narratives and material constraints. Which leads to the most important question in political economy: who benefits and who pays? When policies like this are announced, the public is told that the foreign country pays. The implication is that a tariff is a bill sent abroad, that Ottawa somehow writes a check to Washington. That is a fiction, especially when essential raw materials are involved. Canadian producers did not pay for this threat. If anything, they benefited. When fear of disruption pushes global commodity prices higher, those holding inventory watch the value of their assets rise. The attempt to punish the supplier ended up reinforcing their market power. The real winners were speculators and trading houses that thrive on chaos. Stable markets are bad for speculation. Predictable prices do not create windfalls. But when governments inject shock into supply chains, volatility explodes. Those who know how to trade that volatility make fortunes while the real economy absorbs the damage. And then there is who pays. That bill landed directly on American farmers. Modern farming runs on thin margins. Farmers borrow heavily each spring to buy seed, fuel, and fertilizer, hoping the harvest will cover those costs and leave something to live on. Every season is already a gamble against weather and global prices. When the cost of a core input like potash jumps sharply, it does not reduce profits. It erases them. Many family farms operate close to the edge. A sudden 20 or 30% increase in fertilizer costs is not an inconvenience, it is an existential threat. And farmers cannot pass that cost along. Crop prices are set globally, not locally. A farmer cannot demand more for corn or wheat because a trade dispute erupted in Washington. He absorbs the loss himself. That is the final imbalance. The people with the least power carry the heaviest burden.